Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Pitlochry in this beautiful area of Perth and Kinross. It's my pleasure as Leader of the Council to welcome you all to this meeting with the Scottish Cabinet, and it's my personal pleasure to be able to welcome the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister, our very own John Swinney, and members of the Cabinet who are with us here to discuss face-to-face the issues that you want to raise. And we're gathered here today in Pitlochry Festival Theatre to debate the issues facing the rural economy. And I think this building stands as a beacon of what can be achieved when communities are confident and willing to embrace the opportunities that rurality presents. Not only is this magnificent building a great venue for theatre productions, it also makes the most of the scenery and its setting. And it's an internationally recognised venue for high-quality productions with a skilled staff who are well placed to fill the emerging skills gap in the creative sector, the creative industries sector. Now, on Friday past, we launched our bid for a Tay Cities deal with the Scottish and UK governments, and that bid will be worth £1.84 billion across Tayside and will bring 15,000 new jobs to the area. And as part of that deal, this theatre is bidding for funding to grow its technical and production capacity to provide vocational skills training within a new world-class training centre right here in Pitlochry. And this would provide job opportunities and bring a significant economic benefit to the Highland Perthshire economy. It will also significantly strengthen our bid for UK City of Culture 2021, which, although focused on Perth, will have far-reaching benefits for communities right across Perth and Kinross. And today, the opening of the new SSE Visitor Centre across the river shows just how the rural economy can diversify in new and exciting ways. The Scottish Government's investment in major projects such as the dualling of the A9 also presents us with great opportunities. So, and by making the most of our assets, we can encourage people into the area where they will add to the vibrancy and profitability of the local retail and hospitality sectors here in Pitlochry and Highland Perthshire. So, I think this is an exciting time for Pitlochry and the surrounding area, and it's therefore very appropriate and timely for us to welcome the First Minister and her Cabinet to hear from us today. So I hope you enjoy your day, and if you have the time, and if the members of the Cabinet have the time, you might want to take the opportunity to explore the area beyond the theatre grounds and see just some of the what this great region has to offer. So thank you all for being here today. And I'll now hand you over to Joe Fitzpatrick, MSP, the Minister for Parliamentary Business. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Miller, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's fantastic to be here today in this magnificent theatre. The Cabinet are delighted to be here in Pitlochry for its first Cabinet meeting outside of Edinburgh in 2017. This is the second time this Scottish Government has held a Cabinet meeting in Pitlochry, and we're delighted to be back, especially the Deputy First Minister, who has enjoyed a much shorter commute today than normal. This morning, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister formally opened Scottish and Southern Energy's superb new visitor centre at the Fiscali Dam, and the Cabinet then held its regular weekly meeting within the centre, and I know that the whole Cabinet were extremely impressed. It's a fantastic facility and an outstanding location. It brings back memories to me of as a child when we went on holiday at Fiscali camping site. But the main purpose of today, of course, is to hear from you. We're looking forward to hearing your views and answering your questions. Since coming to office, this Scottish Government has been committed to holding cabinets across the length and breadth of Scotland, from Aberdeen to Alloa, Ullapool to Dumfries. This is your opportunity to ask questions about local or national issues and the work of the Scottish Government. In a moment, you'll hear from the First Minister, We'll then open the floor to take your questions for about an hour. Following that, we hope you'll be able to join us for refreshments and the opportunity to continue the discussions with individual Cabinet members over a cup of tea. So, without any further ado, can I please ask you to welcome the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to you, Joe. Thank you to Councillor Ian Miller, if he's made his way back into the auditorium, for setting the scene so well. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. It's great to be here in Pitlochry. As Joe was just telling you, one of the very first what we call Cabinet on Tour sessions that we had was here in Pitlochry back in 2008. I think it was held that day in the town hall. I seem to remember that was during the summer, so it was a little bit warmer than it is today. But it's great to be back here in Pitlochry for a question and answer session and to be here in this beautiful theatre. Great also to see so many people here on a chilly Monday afternoon to talk about the range of, no doubt, local and national issues that are important to you. And this practice of getting out and about, taking the Cabinet out of Edinburgh to different parts of the country, is something we've tried to do more and more of over the years. It's all part of trying to be as open and accessible to people in different parts of the country as we possibly can be. It follows from that, therefore, that the main purpose of this afternoon's session is not really for you to listen to us, although you'll have to do a little bit of listening to us, but it's much more important for us to listen to you. That indeed is why most of the session has been given over to questions and answers. And I want to stress something at the outset, something that shouldn't need saying, but I'll say it anyway, because sometimes when we do these sessions, people make an assumption that we vet all of the questions in advance and we only take and answer the questions that we want to. Believe me, our lives would be a lot easier if that were true. But it's not true. There's no vetting of questions. You can ask absolutely anything you want to ask. And we will do our level best to give you full answers to the questions that you raise. If we can't provide an immediate answer, because some questions are perhaps quite specific or detailed, then our promise to you is that we'll get back to you. And if for some reason there's a question that you might not feel comfortable about asking in public session, something that's maybe impinging on something that's personally important to you, then you can corner one of us afterwards, or I think you should all have sheets on your chairs. If you fill that in with the detail of the question and hand it over, there'll be boxes collecting these things and we'll give you an answer in writing. But the point I'm stressing, and I do want to stress this is your session. It's for you to ask us whatever you want. So please don't hold back. Use the opportunity, and I hope you enjoy the experience. If past experience of these sessions is anything to go by, we will cover a lot of different subjects today. And so I'm not going to be able to cover every possible topic that might come up later on by way of introduction. But I do want to say just a few words, if you will bear with me. Really just setting the scene and trying to set out for you the general approach that we as a government are seeking to take. You probably have seen in the media that last week the Scottish Parliament debated our budget proposals for the coming year. Our budget, of course, sets out how we use the powers we have over taxation and expenditure fairly and responsibly to deliver the priorities we've set for government. So this afternoon I want to talk briefly about those priorities, in particular about how we aim to grow our economy, including the rural economy, how we fund and deliver world-class public services, and how we ensure that people, as far as possible, have a say in the decisions that affect individuals and communities the length and breadth of the country. In all of this, our core fundamental aim is to create a country that is fairer and more prosperous. And we firmly believe that fairness and prosperity are not competing objectives. They can, in fact, they must go together. We need, obviously, a prosperous economy to create well-paid, fulfilling jobs and to create the revenue that funds the public services that all of us rely on and value so highly. But we also need to have a fair society, one which tries to make full use of the talents of everybody across our country in order to prosper economically. So these things very much go hand in hand. Now, before we got here today, as Ian and Joe were telling you, we held our weekly cabinet meeting at the new Pitlochry Dam Visitor Centre. As all of you know, the Pitlochry Dam is already a major tourist attraction. I'm told 500,000 people cross it every single year. And the new centre, I am absolutely sure, having seen it this morning, will attract many more people. I had the privilege while I was there, and it was an absolutely fascinating experience of meeting some of the original tunnel tigers, the people who built the tunnels and the hydroelectric dams in the post-war era, the people who took the Highlands from a situation just at the end of the Second World War where less than half of households had electricity to, in the space of about 15 years, a position where more than 90% of households in the Highlands had electricity. So people that have done so much to shape modern Scotland as we know it, and their stories were absolutely fascinating. But it struck me when I was there this morning, and it's really interesting, what you have here by Fiscally Loch is a fantastic tourist destination, showcasing local food and drink in the cafe and the shop that is situated there. A centre dedicated to both Scotland's historic and our modern excellence in renewable energy and engineering. In one building, therefore, you get a real sense of three areas: tourism, food and drink, and energy, where Scotland has got not just a really proud heritage, but vast economic potential for the future. And of course, our strengths go way beyond these sectors. We've got a worldwide reputation for life sciences, digital technology, creative industries, financial services. We've got more world-class universities per head of population in Scotland than any country in the world, with the exception of Luxembourg. I'm not sure what Luxembourg is doing better than us, but we're determined to try to overtake them as well. So we've got immense natural resources, we've got skilled and ambitious people. And so the job of government is to do what we can to harness all of these strengths to promote economic growth across the country. Of course, right now, as part of that, we've got a job to do to try to mitigate the economic impact of Brexit. Businesses across the country benefit from membership of the single market. It means they can sell their goods to the rest of the EU without being subject to tariffs or other regulatory barriers. It's been estimated that being outside of the single market could cost Scotland up to 80,000 jobs. That's why we've argued strongly for the UK, albeit it's leaving the EU, to stay in the single market. Now, at the moment, I have to confess that is looking unlikely. The UK government appears to be heading towards what's become known as a hard Brexit, not just outside the EU, but outside the single market as well. Which is why the Scottish Government has suggested ways in which Scotland could retain membership of and the benefits of the single market, not instead of, but in addition to free trade across the UK. That's a solution, a compromise solution, that's trying to respect the different ways in which people in Scotland and the rest of the UK voted, a solution that protects Scottish businesses and jobs and makes a clear statement, which I think is an important statement, that Scotland is an outward-looking internationalist country. So that's what we are working towards and trying to achieve. But as we do that, it's vital that we remain focused on the day-to-day business of government as well. And a really important part of that is about encouraging and supporting businesses. One of the first things the government did in 2007 was create the small business bonus. And what that means here in Perthshire is that more than half of all business premises are not subject to business rates. That's more than 4,000 properties across Perthshire. And across Scotland as a whole, more than 100,000 properties are exempt from business rates altogether. We're also seeking to promote growing companies in key sectors of the economy. Scottish Enterprise helped more than 120 companies in Perthshire just last year, either by providing them with direct financial support or giving them tailored and expert advice on how to innovate, export more or expand what they do. We're also, and this is a key aim, investing in the infrastructure that businesses need. And I hope and believe that some of that investment will bring significant benefits to Pitlochry and to Perthshire more widely. Work on during the A9, for example, all the way to Inverness is now underway, long overdue, but now underway. That's the biggest road transport project in Scotland in a generation. The Kincraig to Dalradi section up near Aviemore is due to be completed this summer, and the whole project will be finished by 2025. And it's going to make road journeys between the north of Scotland and the central lowlands easier, quicker, and importantly, safer as well. We're investing in rail services as well. 2 new early morning services have been introduced on the Highland Main Line, and we've guaranteed the future of the Highland Sleeper service. That franchise, of course, now has its headquarters in Inverness. And we're in the process, and I know this is important to people in every part of Scotland, but particularly in rural parts of our country, we're in the process of transforming our broadband infrastructure. Last week's budget included more than £100 million on broadband over the next year alone. You know, here in Pitlochry, no homes at all had access to fibre broadband at the start of 2014. Now, nearly 1,500 do, and by the end of the year, access will have been extended to all homes in Pitlochry. And that local picture is matched across the country. If you take the Highlands and Islands as an example, in 2014, just 4% of properties had access. Now 76% do, and by the end of this year, that figure will be above 85%. Now, that's progress, but it's not enough progress. We've got a lot more we need to do, which is why we've made the important pledge that by 2021, every household, without exception, and every business premise, without exception, will have access to superfast broadband. We also, of course, are working to improve mobile coverage. And the reason for this is simple. You know, I was talking earlier on about being at Pitlochry Dam and the work that the Tunnel Tigers did to take electricity to more households. In this day and age, access to broadband and mobile technology is just as fundamental as access to electricity was all those years ago. It's fundamental to how businesses operate and to how all of us live our lives. So it's a big responsibility for us as government and a big obligation that we carry to make sure we get that access to everybody as quickly as possible. As I say, that's even more important, I think, in areas like Perthshire than it is to the central lowlands. So it is why we are insisting on that universal service for superfast broadband. It's absolutely fundamental to our overall vision for a fair and sustainable economy. Now, all of this is intended to make Scotland not just a wealthier country, but also a fairer one. If we're to be a genuinely fair society, the growth that we support in our economy should benefit everybody in all parts of the country. And we know that investment in public services is crucial to that. And getting our tax decisions right is really important in that as well. There's been a lot of nonsense spoken recently about Scotland being the highest taxed part of the UK. Believe me, it is utter nonsense. I mean, if you take income tax, the tax that the Scottish Government is now taking responsibility for, nobody will pay more tax in the coming year than they do this year. But we have made an important decision that we're not going to give a tax cut to higher rate taxpayers. Higher rate taxpayers make up about 10% of all income earners in Scotland. And the tax cut that we're asking people to forego amounts to about £7.70 a week. That's less than the cost of a single prescription if you lived in England and had to pay your prescription charges. But why that's an important decision is that not giving people that tax cut enables us to protect many of the benefits that people in Scotland enjoy, that people in other parts of the UK don't enjoy. The ability, if you're young, to go to university without paying £9,000 a year in tuition fees, or the ability, if you're older and need care, to have your personal care needs delivered by the state, not through your own, from your own pocket. So these are important social benefits that we think it's right to protect in a society that's aiming to be fairer. It also helps ensure that we can deliver real terms increases in the budget of our National Health Service and expand childcare substantially over the next few years. And also, and perhaps the best example, invest in education, to do something that I've described as the top priority of this government, not just raise attainment in our schools, but close what's called the attainment gap, how well children do at school based on what kind of background they come from. So last week, John Swinney outlined our pupil equity funding. This is where we're giving additional resources to head teachers in schools up and down the country to enable them to take decisions about extra staff or extra resources to help them close that attainment gap. Schools here in Perth and Kinross will benefit from that fund. Pitlochry High is one of them. And the head teachers at these schools will be in charge of that funding. So these are some of the things that we have set as priorities, very firmly focused on making our economy as strong as possible in difficult times, not just domestically but globally for the economy, and trying through fair tax, investment in public services, investment in education in the next generation to make our society fairer in the future than it has been in the past. So that's some of what we want to do. My last point before I keep my promise and not have you listen to us all afternoon is about how we're trying to do that. Governments are charged with taking decisions. That's why you elect us. We have the responsibility of delivering the things that we promise to deliver. But as a government, we've tried to do that in as inclusive and accessible a way as possible. We want people to be involved in the decisions that affect them. It doesn't mean you'll always agree with things that government does. I'm sure we'll hear this afternoon examples of the things that you don't agree with that the government is doing. But being involved is part of better decision making. And these sessions are a small but important part of being a government that is open, that tries to listen and reflect on what people tell us. So I'll end with that thought, and it really is ending where I started. This is your opportunity to have your say, to tell us the things that are important to you, to tell us what you want us to do more of, to tell us what you want us to do less of, to tell us if there are things we're not doing at all that you think we should be doing. These sessions matter as much to us as they do to you, so it's important to us to hear your views and your thoughts and your questions this afternoon. So thank you very much for joining us, and now let's go on with the important part of the afternoon, which is listening to you and trying to answer your questions. The great beauty of being First Minister, of course, is that I get to answer the easy questions and ask all of my colleagues here to answer the more difficult ones. So thank you very much.
Thank you, First Minister. So we're now going to move on to the formal question and answer session. But first of all, I know there's a number of well-kent faces on the stage, but I'll, I think, nonetheless introduce all of our colleagues. So on my right, your left, we start with Annabel Ewing, who's the Minister for Community Safety. Then Michael Russell, Minister for UK Negotiations on Scotland's Place in Europe. Angela Constance, the Cabinet Secretary for Communities, Social Security and Equalities. We then have the Rural Economy Secretary, Fergus Ewing. Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Culture, Tourism and External Affairs. Then, of course, your own John Swinney, Deputy First Minister and Education Secretary. Then next to the First Minister, Keith Brown, who's the Economy Secretary. Shona Robertson, the Health Secretary. Derek Mackay, Finance Secretary, and another well-kent face in these parts, Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform. So I'm going to take questions in batches of 3 and then invite the First Minister and other members of Cabinet to respond. I've also received a number of questions through social media, and I'll try to include those as we go through. Now, we normally have more questions than time available, so if we don't get a chance to ask your question, then please make sure you use the form on your chair, fill it in and put it in the box at the back of the hall, and every question will receive a written reply. So let's make a start. Can I ask you to raise your hand if you have a question and then wait until the microphone reaches you. If you could please give your name and any organisation that you're representing before asking your question, and try to keep your questions as brief as possible. I'll ask the Cabinet to do likewise with their answer, and hopefully that way we'll get through as many people as possible. So if you could raise your hands if you have a question. So the lady right here at the front. Yeah, the microphone. I'll do the one at a time because otherwise I'll forget where we are.
Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Roy, and I'm just here on a personal basis. I'm not here representing the organisation I work for. It's about transport. I was very interested to hear, the improvements in rail, the improvements for road, which will benefit buses in some way, the A9. But a major concern I have going forward is the sort of increasing reduction in local bus services in Scotland, not just here in Perth and Kinross, but even in the Central Belt. Commercial companies are withdrawing services that are no longer commercially viable. Councils are under pressure to cut budgets. Does the government have a sort of strategic plan as to how to sort of join together with the commercial companies, the councils, and sort of battle this sort of ongoing demise of the local bus service, which is so important to so many people?
Okay, thank you very much. And gentlemen, just at the, yeah.
Ron Greer, local resident in Blairathel, guilty. My question is really in close affinity with that lady's question. I have here 2 bus timetables, which to me designates a note of insignificance to this area. How do we measure that? There are only 2 buses from Glasgow or Edinburgh per day going directly into Pitlochry. One that gets in about 11:30 and another one at 3 minutes to 7 in the evening. Now that to me is an insult from the bus company to all these wonderful tourist attractions we've got here. And it goes right across several portfolios, because this is at the tip of a rural connectivity deficiency. And I'm glad Fergus Ewing is here today. Perhaps he can tell us how you can improve rural connectivity through the bus. And it goes into the environmental profile, because what is happening is an increased demand for car usage, which goes right against the SNP's emissions deficit, and it also affects things like health and tourism. So I would like to know what the Cabinet is going to do about integrated public transport strategically throughout Scotland.
Okay, and person just at the front there, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Gillian. I'm a local mum, and I'm also a childminder. I was at my daughter's nursery the other day, and they mentioned that after 2020, all 3-year-olds will be getting full-time free education. And I just wondered how they would help childminders being able to afford to keep working in that. After that, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the first 2 questions, you'll be glad to know, Ron, I'm going to pass to Fergus Ewing to answer. Bus services, obviously hugely important in rural areas, but I know from my own constituency experience in Glasgow that the reliability and accessibility of bus services is hugely important. So I'll ask Fergus to deal with the bus issue, but maybe going on to Ron's wider point about integration of public transport as well. And then I'll pass to John to deal with the issue around early years education and the role of childminders, which is significant, actually. Fergus.
Yes, thank you, First Minister. I think both of the questioners that raised this issue raised it very well, Margaret and Ron, and spoke for a great many that bus services are absolutely fundamental for many rural communities. And of course, 98% of Scotland is rural. The vast majority of Scotland is comprised of rural or indeed island communities. So there's a huge area to cover. What do we do? Well, we do commit a lot of your money, £50 million a year, in a negotiation with the bus operators. And I can assure you that we're concerned to get the best deal from the bus operators. The amount of money that they get, the BSOG, the bus subsidy grant, is based on mileage. So the longer distance, the more they get paid. So it does incentivise the provision of bus services of longer routes and hence rural areas. My own constituency of Inverness has many small towns and communities, not unlike Pitlochry or Burnham or Dunkeld, where there are these issues, and the services tend to be relatively infrequent, simply because there's perhaps not the number of people to sustain these services. But nonetheless, of course, these services are absolutely essential so that people can travel, for example, from, as I learned in a prior meeting with a lady and her colleagues in the audience who are campaigning to look again at the withdrawal recently of facilities from Burnham and Dunkeld, where hitherto CityLink, where, as I understand it from this morning, Pam, the service north and southward stopped off at Burnham, and that has been withdrawn by the bus operator. Now, I undertook, and I confirm this in front of you all, to look at that again. I will go and I will speak to the head of Transport Scotland, and I will speak to the operators, Parks of Hamilton, about that particular issue. But that, if we solve that, and we will see if we can persuade the company to look again at that, because you're kind of cutting off about 1,500 people, as I understand it, from better services. But the wider problem, I think, needs to be looked at, and that's why we're committed to a bus bill, a transport bill rather, which will look at improving services. I mean, plainly, you know, there can't be a bus service everywhere, every time you want. There is a matter of degree and balance. But I do absolutely agree, as a constituency member for quite a period of time with many small communities, that it is essential. The last thing I would say is that we have got the concessionary fare scheme, which does allow people with a disability and senior citizens to travel around the country, and we're committed to maintaining that scheme, and that has, I think, enabled people to get out and about, but that's not much use if you haven't got a service to use.
I think before I hand over to Jeremy, one of the benefits of meetings like this is not just we get to hear your views, we then are able to take some of these questions and views back to our agencies or private companies, in this case the bus operators. So Fergus will, not just in terms of the particular services we're talking about, but these general issues that you've raised, be able to go back and discuss with the operators how we improve on these things. And as Fergus indicated, we are at the moment looking at developing legislation around bus services, which should help to deal with some of these issues as well. John, do you want to take on the issue of our expansion of childcare, generally just set out what that is, but also our views in terms of the central role childminders will have to play in the delivery of that?
Well, First Minister, what we've done so far is expanded the availability of early years education for all 3- and 4-year-olds, and for some vulnerable 2-year-olds to 600 hours in Scotland. And our commitment in the course of this parliamentary term is to expand that to 1,140 hours. We've just concluded a consultation on how we should go about doing that. And the consultation exercise, we're reflecting on the very significant amount of material that's come back on that. But it was deliberately constructed to be as open as possible. Because we wanted to make it clear that we saw different ways in which that commitment to 1,140 hours could be delivered to meet the needs of different families in different circumstances. And one of our concerns about the existing early years provision is that it's quite rigid for families. It doesn't provide the flexibility that childminders, for example, are able to provide in the way in which they can offer that service to children and to their families. So as we look at how we implement this in practice for the 1,140 hours, we are determined to make sure there's a significant role for childminders in that process. We don't want to, I sensed in your question a worry that essentially all the children are going to be going into 1,140 hours in full-time settings. That won't be the case in all circumstances. We want to retain enough flexibility to make sure that the needs of children and families can be met in appropriate settings, and that will retain enough scope for childminders to continue to be active, because we recognise the significant value of that provision, particularly enabling families for parents to be able to go out to work and to have their children in safe and secure and well-supported environments in that process. So we're looking very carefully at those issues, and as we design the way in which this is rolled out and funded, we will be ensuring there is a strong role for childminders in that process.
One of the bits of parental feedback we've had since we've been talking about this expansion is that some parents, particularly of younger children, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, although they would welcome having more state-funded childcare, wouldn't necessarily want a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old to be in formal childcare for a whole day, and therefore we've been encouraged to look at what's called almost blended childcare provision, so that a child might be with a childminder for a morning and in a nursery in the afternoon, or vice versa. So actually, as we expand the provision, I think very firmly we'll actually be looking at an increased role for childminders in the overall provision rather than a decreased role, which will be good for childminders, but I think in terms of the quality of the childcare experience for young people, we'll be enhancing that as well as a result.
Okay, next questions. Okay, gentleman right at the back here. Yeah.
Paul Leslie, Scottish and EU citizen. Can land reform offer opportunities to young farmers and people wanting to get into farming?
Okay, thank you. And more questions? Gentleman at the very end there.
I'm Tam, and I'm a Scottish tea grower. I'm asking on behalf of my business, which grows tea about 15 miles from here. I was the first to do in Scotland. John Swinney has come and picked tea for us. I'm advised that it's ready now if his wife wants it. However, the question is to do with the fact that the phrase Scottish tea is being used blatantly by a number of tea companies since we've come about and have encouraged other people to grow tea in the country. And it's a phrase that isn't protected as a geo-specific term. Now, we've done very well. We've won awards for what we're doing. And a lot of companies are moving their phraseology from Scottish blend to Scottish tea in order to sell more of their product, which isn't in any way fair trade, organic, or grown in Scotland. I'd like to ask for the First Minister and Deputy First Minister's support in securing Scottish tea as a phrase that means grown in Scotland.
Okay, thank you. And the lady just, in the middle, right in the middle. No, just behind you, the black, The microphone will come to you.
Whether we live in the country, town or city, we are all affected by what happens in America. I really feel that Donald Trump is a narcissist, a pathological liar, and a real threat to the people on this planet, and indeed the planet itself. How do you feel about him, and is he welcome in Scotland?
I feel you should have told us what you thought of him rather than sitting on the fence. I'll come to that question last. Was it Tam? Sorry, I didn't. Yeah. I'm very happy to give you that assurance of trying to work with you in the first instance, talking to you and maybe some of your colleagues about how we get that protection, because I think it is a really important issue, which we've had in other areas of the food and drink industry. So I'm not going to be able to answer the question definitively for you today, but certainly there is a willingness to try to work with you to do it. I had the great pleasure of, I think not last year, but the year before, of launching a Scottish tea brand in New York, of all places, which was fantastic. Indeed, yeah. Is that your company? It is, yeah. Yeah, well, absolutely delicious tea, I have to say, if that's not unfair promotion. But yes, let's, if we can hook up at the end to get your details so that we can take that discussion forward. Paul, you raised a question. Started out, it's about land reform. Rosanna is responsible for land reform, but because you talked particularly about land reform in the context of new entrants into farming, I'm going to ask Fergus to answer, because he has cabinet responsibility for agriculture and farming. Both Fergus and I will be at the NFU AGM tomorrow, actually, and this is one of the issues that will be getting talked about, how we get the next generation into farming. So Fergus, can you take on that question? And then if there's any sort of land reform aspects of it that you want to cover at the end, we can come to you afterwards.
Yes, thank you, First Minister. And the question is about young entrants, really, and how do we get young people into farming? And the average age of a farmer in Scotland is 58. It's been 58 for quite a long time, actually, and therefore that illustrates the need for new blood. And of course, most new entrants are from farming families. I mean, that's right, and it's right and proper, and that's the way it will always be, I suspect. But we need more. So what are we doing? Well, we have had a scheme to offer financial help, and that is continuing. And we've had a scheme to offer to make available land from the Forestry Commission. And I met about 10 of the participants in that scheme at the Royal Highland Show in June. It's very interesting to hear what they said, because 10 years was the length of the lease in the Forestry Commission. Their view was perhaps that wasn't long enough to enable them to get bank support. And they were also interested in mentoring, in not making the mistakes that older farmers perhaps could teach them about. And a lot of mentoring is done by other farmers, by the banks actually, doing a tremendous amount of work. We also have a crofter scheme, incidentally. I know this is not a crofting county, but it's also important for the north of Scotland to help crofters get houses, a house of their own in the country. And we've helped about 800, and we're going to do a lot more on that as well. So, and finally, I had a meeting with Henry Graham, who some of you will know, a distinguished farmer, who is helping us look at every single public body in Scotland to see if they have any land that is available, that could be made available, not necessarily a huge extent of hectareage, but some land available in SNH, Scottish Water, even some of the other quangos that you wouldn't associate with land holdings, as well as local authorities. So I hope Ian Miller's listening, incidentally. So, you know, I think we've got to look at it for around the whole way, and it's not a problem, finally, that governments will necessarily solve for themselves, because after all, a young person going into farming must have the drive, must have the passion for the land, and must have the determination to see the job through. It's our job to provide them with the assistance to give them a reasonable chance at success. And I'm determined as the Farming Minister to do just that.
Okay, thanks, Fergus. Let me turn to the non-controversial issue of the new President of the United States. To be light-hearted before moving on to what are very serious issues, I think, I don't know if I'm the only one, but there's almost a kind of new milestone in every day when you check Twitter to see if the President is up yet, to see what he's tweeted. He's just tweeted this morning that this may have some relevance to all of us, that all negative opinion polls are fake. So there we have it. So the next time we have an unfortunate or unwelcome opinion poll, I'm just going to cite and quote the President of the United States. Be more serious about it. You know, I'm absolutely horrified by some of what the President has done since he took office just, 2 weeks ago. It feels a lot longer than that. In particular, the actions he's taken, which of course are being debated and considered in the courts in America today, actually, but the action he took around suspending the refugee programme, banning Syrian refugees, and banning, albeit temporarily at the moment, people from certain Muslim-majority countries from travelling to the United States, I think are both wrong in principle. I think banning people from entering a country on the basis of their origin or their faith or religion is wrong in principle. But I think it's also wrong from a practical perspective. I think that kind of move helps to instill grievances that then make it more difficult to tackle extremism and terrorism, which we all have an interest in tackling. So I've been concerned to the point of, at times, horrified by much of what President Trump has done in his first days in office. And I think there is a great deal, and I share it, a great deal of concern and anxiety about what might unfold in the months and years to come. And some of it, while we can laugh at it and you know, at times be mildly entertained by it as it unfolds on Twitter, some of it is very deeply concerning views that strike at some of the constitutional foundations, not just of the United States, but of any country. You know, attacks on judges who happen not to agree with the policies of the government. Believe me, as government, there are many occasions where you don't like things that judges and courts decide, but all governments know that is an essential part of the checks and balances in any democracy, and the rule of law is such a crucial part of any democracy that any attempts to undermine that, I think, should alarm all of us. So I shared the concerns that have been articulated. The question was, is he welcome in Scotland, and how do we react? I've been very clear that I think it would be inappropriate for a state visit to go ahead while the bans, travel bans are in place, for example. This will be, you know, the earliest, I think, ever, certainly in a long, long time, that a newly elected president would have had a state visit. I think President Obama was into his second term in office before he had a state visit here. So nobody's saying the president can't come to the UK, but a state visit is a very important and you know, unique thing, and I think it would be inappropriate in these circumstances. Beyond that, you know, while I've got my views, which I've just articulated, we've all got our views, you know, that has to be balanced with a recognition and a respect that he is the elected president of the United States. And Scotland and the United States have got long-standing, very deep, very important relationships, you know, family relationships, cultural, economic and business relationships that are really important to us. So it's important to me as First Minister, to us as government, to have a constructive relationship with the new administration. So people say to me, would you refuse to meet him if he came to Scotland? Well, you know, whatever my views as First Minister, I'm not going to refuse to meet the President of the United States, because the relationship between our countries is important and is much bigger than who the leaders of those countries happen to be at any given time. But what I've also said, which I think is important for all leaders in all countries, I'm not going to maintain a diplomatic silence over things that are really important in terms of core fundamental values. Donald Trump doesn't strike me as the kind of leader who will maintain a diplomatic silence if I do something that he disagrees with. So I don't think any leader should just keep quiet for fear of upsetting him when there is something really important at stake. So I think that kind of constructive relationship based on respect, but based on all of us standing up for the things we believe in, is how we should proceed. I suspect it's going to be a rocky 4 years as far as the relationship, not just with Scotland, but with many countries in the United States go. But I think if we all stand up for the values that underpin those relationships, then we won't go far wrong. So that's my views, for what they're worth, on President Trump.
Okay, gentleman with the blue, yeah. The microphone to the front middle, just in front of the, yeah. Okay.
Malcolm Busby, Pitlochry. I'm a pensioner, ex-financial services industry. This is my question. Please, can the First Minister explain why she is besotted with everything EU? And can she give details why she thinks that Scotland and the residents of Pitlochry will be freer and economically better off when controlled by Brussels with the euro as Scotland's currency?
Okay, and then the gentleman here near the front as well. Yeah, the paper head. Yeah.
Name's Ian Ivory. I'm a farmer, and the question for the ministers is the availability of affordable rural housing and the priorities in the new proposed legislation regarding modern tenancies. We have a situation with short-term assured tenancies that when they expire, they must be replaced by a new modern tenancy, and that does not consider that the appointment of an agricultural worker is an appropriate, reasonable circumstance to make the house available. If we employ somebody for religious purposes, it is, and I just wondered how these priorities have been sorted out.
Okay, thank you. One more. Okay, gentleman, yeah.
I'm Richard Howarth. I work for Glen Hydro, which is one of a number of companies developing hydro schemes around rural Scotland. The development of these schemes is very important to this area. The recent sharp reduction in feed-in tariffs has resulted in a decline of this industry. And while struggling with this, we've been hit with a double whammy. First, the removal last year of the business rates relief, and secondly, we're receiving new rateable values of schemes, which is several times, in many cases, in excess of the previous values. these commercial constraints and the uncertainties they give us are killing this industry, which is important both to this area and a lot of rural Scotland. Can you help?
Okay, I'm going to ask Fergus to deal with the issues around farming and tenancies, although Angela may want to contribute there as well in terms of the wider housing issues. Then ask Keith to deal with the issues that Richard's just raised about hydro schemes, feed-in tariffs, business rates, and lastly, Malcolm, I'll come back to your question on the EU. So Fergus, do you want to kick off?
Well, I think Ian has raised a point which Angela Constance will cover, because my colleague Angela is dealing with the housing legislation. So perhaps I can just say a few words that it is extremely important that we have housing available in the countryside for those that require it. And Angela, I'm sure, will deal with the legislative aspects, I think, which were the focus of Ian Ivory's question. Perhaps before she does so, maybe I can just make one comment, which is that I am aware that there is a slight tension between the planning system as it is and the provision of development in the countryside generally. And that's why recently myself and Kevin Stewart, the Minister responsible for planning, held a summit meeting to look at how we can make more flexible planning in the countryside to enable the provision of more rural development of a sustainable variety. And that would, of course, include many things, Ian, as I'm sure you will know. Extend permitted development rights, perhaps, for larger agricultural buildings, extend permitted development rights, and remove lack of clarity for things like polytunnels, and a whole series of detailed matters that are of direct import to many, many farmers. That's why we held this summit, and it's why, incidentally, we are having a white paper on planning to flex the position so that we can see more rural development, particularly if you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, that as we see more threats to retail premises by online retailers, that we are going to need to have more rural development as time goes on, and the traditional model of town-rural is becoming a bit antiquated and outdated. And therefore, we do need to look at the planning aspect in agriculture, and I'm determined to do what we can to encourage, for example, the development of disused buildings and outhouses and turn them or enable them to be turned into housing, and perhaps have permitted development rights so to do. So I'm pleased that you've raised the question. I think the specific question, however, was focused on a piece of legislation in relation to the issue of short assured tenancies, which I think are of 6 months duration, but tend to be repeated at the end of the 6 months unless there's a change of will on the part of the landlord or the tenant. So very often they can run on more or less ad infinitum if there's a will on both parties. I think that's the existing system, and I believe that is being the subject of some alteration. So with your permission, First Minister, I think pass to Angela to deal with that aspect.
Thank you, Fergus. In broad terms, we have an overarching commitment as a government to increase the supply of affordable homes, not just in rural Scotland, but the length and breadth of Scotland. So we've got a very ambitious target of 50,000 affordable homes. In the last Parliament, we had a target to deliver 30,000 affordable homes, which we met, but in excess of 10%, we actually delivered 33,000 affordable homes. So despite the uncertainty around Brexit, we remain absolutely committed to our overarching target of 50,000 affordable homes. In terms of some of the issues that are particular to rural communities, one of the first debates in this new Parliament, we announced that we would have a £25 million housing fund specifically for rural communities in recognition of some of the additional challenges. And I'm also very conscious that for rural communities, infrastructure can be a particularly acute issue and can be a particularly difficult issue to overcome. So we have a range of flexible loans and infrastructure grants as well to help alleviate that. But every local authority just now will have submitted their strategic housing improvement plan to the Scottish Government. I know the Housing Minister, Kevin Stewart, is reading his way through every one, and there is an obligation on local authorities to be reflecting the housing needs of their particular area. And as a government, we're determined to work very closely with our partners in local government to ensure that massive funding will come. Well, I was coming to the legislation, sir. There was tenancy legislation introduced in the last Parliament. We are currently rolling through with the regulations and the guidance of that. The overarching purpose of the regulations was to be both fair to tenants and to those who own and let their properties. So we will continue to look at some of the more granular and fine detail. I'm happy to discuss that with the gentleman later on today if he so wishes. And in terms of the planning review, because the planning review is crucial in terms of getting our ducks in a row, in terms of meeting our ambitions on housing and delivering more housing, because many of the housing problems, many of the community problems we face are due to the lack of affordable housing. So we've had the consultation on the planning review. We've had a review of planning. We're now moving forward into a consultation, and we will be bringing forth a very important piece of planning legislation as we progress throughout this Parliament.
Okay, I think though, sorry, was it Ian? I didn't catch your name. Ian. You're raising something here that we need to talk to you a bit more about, because it's always the case with legislation. Legislation. Sure. Look, what I'm saying to you is, often legislation, the aims of the legislation are one thing. What we've got to watch is unintended consequences. So I think you're right. Now, it may be that we can't come to an agreement, but Angela and Fergus will talk to you at the end just to make sure we're not missing something here in terms of the more general situation. So I think you're right to raise it with us, and thank you for that. I'm going to hand to Keith now to take on Richard's questions about hydro schemes.
I think the 2 points, if I'm correct in understanding, Richard, that you raised. First of all, in terms of feed-in tariffs and the changes that there have been over a number of years, I fully acknowledge that. I visited a company in Glasgow recently who started off under a different regime. 90% of their products, actually mainly going to farms, were sold within the UK. And then with the sharp change that happened in feed-in tariffs, that's now completely changed. 90% of what they produce goes abroad. And the point they made, which I think is perhaps the point you're making, is that instability is no good for long-term planning. In relation to feed-in tariffs, we don't make the rules on that. We've made many representations to the UK government. We have recently produced our energy strategy, which says where we are going in relation to that, and hopefully that will be helpful in trying to produce some long-term vision, but happy to discuss the issue further with you. And on the second point, again, I would acknowledge that with business rates, there is, especially when you have revaluations, there is uncertainty created by that. There's no question of that. They're a necessary evil, if you like, that we have to have these revaluations. But I would also acknowledge the uncertainty. We have, as the First Minister said earlier on, got to a position now where we've extended the small business bonus scheme, which obviously doesn't apply to your company from the question that you've asked. But that has taken hundreds of thousands, another 100,000 actually as a result of the budget we hope to pass, out of paying business rates altogether. But there is uncertainty just now. And to try and address that uncertainty, we have appointed Ken Barclay, who's going to review in the business rates regime that we have to see if we can make sure we can provide as stable and as sympathetic a business rates regime. We think we've done some substantial work already in having a very competitive regime, but we acknowledge there are still concerns, and that's why Ken Barclay is looking at this. But happy to have a discussion with you both on the business rates and on the feed-in tariff issues.
I think it would be on business rates. We also are in a difficult period just now with business rates because of the periodic revaluation that is underway, which is not concluded yet, and is causing some understandable angst in different sectors. So all of these things are interacting at the moment. I think it would be good if Keith and Derek, as Finance Minister, who's got overall responsibility for the business rate scheme, were to catch you at the end, just again, a bit like the last question, just so that we are with a general policy we're understanding particular issues in particular sectors. So that would be a worthwhile discussion to have. And let me finally, Malcolm, deal with your question about the EU. I'm sure there's a range of views in this auditorium just now about Brexit in or out of the EU. I can assure you I'm far from besotted with the EU. I think there's lots, well, which is a fair point. I think there's lots wrong with the European Union. Believe me, I could rant and rave probably for the rest of today and well into tomorrow about the things about the European Union that I don't like, that other people would have a different list of things. On balance, though, I think we're better off in it than out of it. The European Union, when all said and done, is an organisation of independent countries, not giving up their independence, but coming together, firstly, to cooperate on issues that no single country can deal with alone, climate change being a good example of that, but also creating a big single market for free trade of goods and services. So the European single market is the biggest in the world, 500 million people. And for a country like Scotland that geographically is on the periphery of Europe, the benefits that we get of tariff-free trade and trade that is free of some of the regulatory barriers that you would otherwise have is probably even greater than countries that are more central geographically to the heart of the market. So I think we're better off in the EU than out of it. And of course, Scotland in the EU referendum voted by quite a considerable margin to be in. So as First Minister, I think I've got an obligation to argue that case. But as the Scottish Government, and Mike Russell is leading this for us, we've not been sticking absolutely rigidly to our preferred option here. We've tried to compromise. So I accept that the UK as a whole is coming out of the EU, but can we find ways of protecting the things that are best about it, single market membership in particular? So we've been trying to put forward common sense compromise solutions that try to, if not keep everybody happy, because that's not usually possible, then get the best possible outcome. It's fair to say we've been struggling a bit to get the UK government to sort of meet us halfway in that discussion. But I think it's important that we press that case, because we've got quite a wealth of independent analysis now that says that the impact to Scottish businesses of being locked out of the single market will be quite severe. Maybe not in the immediate term, but over the medium to long term, in terms of jobs lost, in terms of investment that we might not get that we could otherwise have got. Because a lot of companies, international companies that invest in Scotland or the UK as a whole, do so because it gives them access to the single market. So Japanese companies, for example, access to the single market is a very important part of their decision to locate here. So these are big issues for Scotland, and I think we've got a duty as a government to try to find the best outcome, and an outcome that has Scotland's voice heard rather than just completely cast aside. So that is what we'll continue to do, but we will be mindful as we do that different people have different opinions. Although Scotland voted to remain, a lot of people voted to leave the EU, and there are particular concerns in the fishing sector, for example, that we've got to take account of. So I promise you I'll try to appear less besotted in future. Of course.
How confident are you in these forecasts? You made the comment that 80,000 jobs will be lost in Scotland.
Yeah.
Now, if you look back to the IMF, to the Bank of England, to the Treasury, their economic forecasts have been absolutely appalling in terms of what they said. Even the chief economist of the Bank of England said it was a Michael Fish time.
Yeah.
Now, economists, if you look back, are worse than weather forecasts in forecasting what is going to happen. Some of them can't even forecast what happened yesterday. Now, and
I think
confidence as a government, and do you yourself have any economic forecast?
I think that's a fair question, and actually, before the referendum last year, I was very critical of some of these forecasts. The reason I was critical of them was because they struck me then as being the same kind of overblown scaremongering that we heard during the Scottish referendum about what would happen and all the doom and gloom. So I do think you're right. I think there's a need to be sceptical. Some of the forecasts that were made for what would happen immediately haven't come to pass. Now, I think it's important to remember that some of them haven't come to pass because action was taken by the Bank of England to avert some of that. So the Bank of England took action to shore up the economy effectively. Well, there's no proof, but I think there's probably quite a lot of evidence that would say that the action the Bank of England took in the immediate days after the referendum had an impact there. But you're right, in terms of economic forecasts are just that. The forecasts I'm talking about come from a range of different sources, but they tend not to be short-term forecasts, they're more long-term. Now, 80,000 jobs is a very specific number. The chances of that forecast being absolutely correct are slim, but if it's half of that, that's still jobs that I would rather not see as lose. And sometimes, and I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, which is even worse sometimes in terms of you get two in a room and you get three different opinions. But sometimes you just have to apply your common sense. If you take the country out of a single market of 500 million people, where currently you have no tariffs, you have no regulatory barriers, you have completely free trade, and you replace that with barriers of some description, common sense tells you that there's going to be a price to be paid for that. So I accept your scepticism about some of the forecasts and actually share some of your scepticism about some of the forecasts. But I think we can all apply our own common sense and probably come to a view that's not a million miles away from them.
Okay. I know there's a number of students in the audience from Pitlochry High, so I wonder if there's any questions from any of the students. Yeah.
On the left there.
Yeah, on the left, yeah.
I'm Kieran Ferns from Pitlochry High School. I was wondering if you were to terminate the contract with Abellio, what the backup plan would be.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question from the school? Okay, just the one, right, that's fine. I've got a couple of social media questions in, which I think are probably quite important ones. So Yvonne Smith, who's from Aberfeldy, she's concerned about NHS ambulance service in the area, particularly in relation to the reliance on emergency cover by the Scottish charity Air Ambulance Services. And she's saying that they have to raise funds for this to cover the gap, and they also are part of the first responders response, and just asking for a comment from that. And then another one from Sarita Murray, who's concerned about the number of empty shops in Perth in particular, and she's saying some of the landlords who open them have no interest in letting them out. Do we have plans as a government to tax the owners of empty businesses so there's an incentive for these properties to be put into use?
Okay, Fergus, you're having to work for your 11 this afternoon. I'll let you deal with Abellio, ScotRail, and what happens if we terminate the contract. And then Shona, if you can say a word about ambulances, and Derek, you can maybe deal with the empty shops from the business rates, town centre policy perspective. Fergus.
I don't know if there's any chance of a productivity bonus.
None.
You've
You're
got
well
to try.
enough paid.
Well, it's a very good question from a student at the back. Of course, there has been a lot of publicity in the run-up to Christmas about problems in the railways. Incidentally, the problems of the railways were severe, and we don't in any way condone them, but they were actually never quite as bad as the service down south. But the Transport Minister, Hamza Yousaf, gave his absolute attention to that. At around about 6 a.m, he had a daily phone call with the management of ScotRail. He turned up himself to stations, he got his sleeves rolled up, and he got in about it, to use the phrase that I'm fond of deploying about how we should do our job. Just yesterday, the performance rate was 90.1%. The standard set in the contract is 91.3%. Why it is that, I'm not quite sure, but there it is. And therefore, we are back on track, First Minister, to achieving the targets that the public expect. What would happen if the contract were terminated? Well, we're not in that ballpark, but it's a fair question. And it is right, I think, that we look at the possibility of the public running the railways. We do have devolved responsibility for ScotRail, but not for Network Rail. That still remains a divided industry. And I think even down south, the penny is beginning to drop that perhaps that's not the best way to run the railways. And perhaps if there were looked at again the possibility of public control, then it might be possible to run them without the disruption, the complication, the duplication, and the enormous expense of the use of consultants and so on that we see that seems to be prevalent in in the railways?
What we can't do is we can't not tender for the franchise. We're not allowed. We don't have the power to award it directly without a tender. What we will have the power to do in future, which we haven't had until very recently, is allow a public sector organisation to bid for the contract. That wasn't even allowed until very recently under Westminster legislation. So what we've said is that if the contract has to be terminated early, which we hope is not the case, or when it terminates on schedule, we will work now to make sure that there is a possible public sector bid can come forward to bid to run the railways. Because, you know, I think there are many people in Scotland would think having the railways run by and in public hands again is a good thing. So that may be something that we can look forward to in the future. Shona, do you want to say a word or two about ambulances before Derek takes over on empty shops?
Yes, thank you, First Minister. Let me just say a little bit first about the air ambulance and just pay tribute to everybody who has been involved in the funding of the Scottish charity Air Ambulance. I had the pleasure of visiting it and seeing it for myself, and it's a great effort by the public. But of course, it is staffed by Air Ambulance Service paramedics, and as part of the Air Ambulance Service, we're the only part of the UK as a government that actually funds the Air Ambulance Service. In other parts of the UK, every air ambulance is funded by charity. In Scotland, we have 2 fixed-wing aircraft and we have 2 helicopters, and the charity air ambulance is in addition to that, so it helps to add extra capacity to our air ambulance service, and it's a fantastic extra resource. Also, just on the ambulance service itself, we have put some additional money into the ambulance service, and that's going to deliver 200 additional paramedics, and there'll be 16 additional paramedics in the Tayside area. So some of those paramedics will be working within this area, adding capacity, and 2 additional relief ambulance technicians have just been recruited to work in this area, as well as a specialist paramedic who's currently undergoing training, so extra personnel to help service the area. And it is important as well to recognise the role of the community first responder schemes. Now, they are absolutely not a replacement for the Scottish Ambulance Service, and are never sent to an incident in place of ambulance crews, but they are an additional help to build resilience in communities when people need that support. And again, I would want to pay tribute to those who have come forward to volunteer for that. The Scottish Ambulance Service is currently delivering training for a new community first responder scheme in the Aberfeldy area, and we'd be happy to meet members of the community to discuss any issues with the delivery of services. Anybody from Aberfeldy who would want to take part in that, then please let us know. So it is important in rural areas that we bring all of these services together to provide a safe and sustainable service for communities, to make sure that the right resource can get there as quickly as possible.
Okay, Derek.
Sarita's asked an excellent question, but just before I answer that, from the high school, is John Dexter here? Yeah, could you stand up, please? This is John Dexter. You can sit down now. I just want to let you all know that straight after the cabinet meeting, his mother works in the Hydro Cafe and said, "I'll give you a piece of tiffin if you embarrass my son." I'm a politician that likes to keep my promises, you understand. But back to the serious...
I can only apologise to you, John. I'll sack him later.
Yeah. Rest assured, I'm in charge of the country's finances. But Sarita's question is an excellent one, and I'm glad I get the opportunity to talk about it. It was really, should we tax landlords for keeping their premises closed? We've actually changed government policy, because there was a time when you got empty property rates relief, almost to keep your premises closed, and that's changed. So there is a tax now. You pay the same as others if it's closed. But to incentivise landlords to open up their premises, there's the Fresh Start initiative, where you can get rates relief if you open up properties that have previously been closed, and that does include retail. There's also the specific support scheme within Perth and Kinross around rates as well for specific retail support, as well as what we're doing as a government around small business bonus scheme and lowering the poundage for everyone who pays business rates. And there's also a review of business rates, as the Economy Secretary's touched upon, to make sure that we're using all the incentives appropriately. So we have no plans for any new taxes on landlords who keep their premises closed, because they are now contributing, but there are plenty of incentives to try and stimulate the economy to support existing businesses and have people open new businesses.
Okay. And gentleman there with the white T-shirt. Yep.
Hello, my name is Lewis Donaghy, and I'm in my last year at school in the Aberfeldy School. The EU provides funding for universities and shares in projects with Scottish universities. My question today is, how is the Scottish Government going to combat the loss in funding to universities from leaving the EU?
Okay, and then lady just, yeah.
Hello, I'm Kirsty Leishman. I'm from Killiecrankie, and I'm a co-owner of a small tourism business. I'd like to know how you can give me more confidence that you are taking seriously the views and the courageous work of the likes of people like John Muir Trust and other people very committed to the wild spaces in Scotland as you progress your very ambitious targets for things and actions around things like the A9. I cannot, and I'd love you all, once you'd come out of this building, just to take a look at the view for 20 seconds. Benbrackie and all the hills around is probably why people come here. And I can't underestimate the balance that you've got to face of progress, but I want to know what you can do to not just protect, but positively develop our wild spaces, because so many of our tourism and visitor numbers are precisely because of the existence of the wild spaces in Scotland. I find the A9 both a very disturbing and potentially very specifically business impacting initiative, and I can't quite believe in this day and age that building more roads is going to really be the long-term answer to what we need to face around climate change and local impact. So.
And if you just move the microphone just forward to, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Susie Anderson. I must be one of the few Welsh women that live around here. I'm all for progress in Scotland because Scotland's my home and Scotland is what I love. And I understand the progress of the A9 has to go ahead. But does it have to go ahead at the risk of people's homes? My home will no longer be. You say that you need to build more houses. Is somebody going to build a home for the people whose homes are going to be destroyed? Yeah. And it's not just myself, my neighbours, the neighbouring villages. Who made that decision that it was okay to destroy someone's home? Because none of you would like yours destroyed. We have worked hard at our homes, and we will fight for our homes. And I'd like to think that the First Minister can understand that people are protective of their homes. Our homes are our castles, and mine is mine. As with my fellow friends, we want our homes to stay where they are. We do not want a road 13 foot from our front door.
Whereabouts do you?
I live 6 miles down at Ballinlough.
Okay.
I will have the A9 13 foot from my front door, and the access road for Guy and Tullymet will be 8 foot from my back door. So I have cars at 70 miles an hour at the front and 40 miles an hour at the back. There is no safety there. And do you lot think it's fair to live like that? Because I surely don't.
Okay. Okay, Mike, do you want to take the question from Lewis about university funding? I'm going to ask Rosanna to talk about Kirsty's point from the perspective of protecting our environment. Obviously, there were other issues about tourism. Fiona might want to say a word about what we're doing to support the tourism sector more generally. And then perhaps Fergus, but I might say a word or two about Susie's point, because I do understand exactly where you're coming from. But if we can start off with Mike with Lewis's question.
One of the sectors that will have the most adverse impact in Scotland with the UK if it leaves the EU will be higher education, and in 3 different ways. First way is research funding and research workforce. 25% of those who work in university research comes from other EU countries, and the access to research funding through Horizon 2020 will be cut off. There will be an impact on student numbers, but there will also be the overall impact on excellence, because if you reduce the type of research activity that's taking place, if you reduce the flow of excellent students, particularly postgraduate students, then you will find that people will be more reluctant to come to take part in what, as the First Minister said, are the best universities in the world, 5 in the top 200. So the best thing that could happen would be the status quo, that is to remain with the present situation, present flow of funding, and particularly the present free movement of people. If that's not going to happen, then you've got to find the least worst thing that comes next. And that lies in remaining in the single market in the way that we've proposed within the paper that we published in December, so that free movement of people continues, so that people want to come here. Participation in the European research programmes such as Horizon 2020, which countries within the single market but not in the EU can still buy into, and there's a recognised formula for that. And also making sure that there is a welcome to students and to staff who come here. And that's perhaps the most important thing, that people believe that these universities are ones where they will not only learn, but find places where they can work and participate in the long term. Shona Robertson and I were in Glasgow University in part of the hospital section last week, talking to leading academics on the cutting edge of certain medical sciences. We're saying now when they put applications in for European funding and for European projects, the reaction is, well, maybe you can take part, but we don't want you leading these because we don't know if you'll be here in 5 years' time. So we need to have continued access to the single market if we can't still be in the European Union, and that would be the best solution. We need to show that we are open for business in higher education, and we need to show that we're still keen to attract and retain the best staff. This is a big difficulty. It's a big part of negotiation. And I have to say we also need to get the UK government listening to this, because I don't think they even recognise themselves the damage they will do to institutions both north and south of the border, which is very hard to undo considering that these have built their reputation over many generations.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to come back off the back of what Mike Russell has said, because the original question was about universities, but of course there are a number of other research providers in Scotland that aren't universities. If you think about the Hutton Institute just outside Dundee, that was the Scottish Crop Research Institute, and the same arguments and issues that arise in respect of universities also apply there, and there's a very significant challenge in that. They happen to be in my portfolio as opposed to universities that sit elsewhere. And in actual fact, if I can just say to people, my portfolio is very broad, and I've actually looked at the 15 questions that have been asked so far. I could have said something easily in at least 8 of them. At least 8 of them. Simply because the issues that arise in so many other parts of policy will impact as well. And the lady that asked about wild spaces in connection with the road building shows how it can be very difficult to separate policy issues out. And that's what I have to deal with all of the time. The issue of wild spaces and wild land in Scotland is something that is and can be highly controversial, as I'm sure Kirsty knows, because there are very few areas in Scotland where there isn't human habitation. There are very few areas where people have not, over long periods of history, tried to eke out a living, and therefore we're always having to find that balance between protection and conservation and ensuring that that doesn't mean that people end up unable to actually live and work off the land as well.
And that's a constant tension. Some of it is resolved by for example, the recent decision by SNH to indicate the areas that are not to be considered suitable for wind turbines. That's one of the ways in which that's been looked at. The issue with land in Scotland is that from a single piece of land, we're looking for so many different things. We're looking at the ability to build houses, the issue of transport, how to make a living, how to protect from flooding. All of these things are issues that a single piece of land might be looked to for answers and can't actually provide the answer for every single one of those things simultaneously. So it is about balance, and my job as the Environment Minister, which is to do with the environment part of my portfolio, is to try and ensure that that balance is kept all the time in the best and most appropriate way for the areas that we're talking about.
Okay, I mean, the environment is so fundamentally important to us for its own sake, for the sake of future generations, but also, you know, the economic benefit that flows from, you know, the quality of the environment we've got, particularly around tourism. Fiona, do you want to just briefly say a word about tourism in this context?
I mean, we live in the most beautiful of countries, and you know, we've just seen a rough guide saying that Scotland should be, you know, the second most important country to visit this year. And it's that balance between making sure that people can share the beauty that we have, but also to do it in a responsible way. And I think that's where what we can try and do as government is to encourage people where they have got that access to, whether it's adventure tourism, whether it's in walking, etc., to make sure that the facilities are there to protect what is wonder of the wild spaces, but also allow access in a way that is responsible. And in terms of what we try and do on a national basis, this is the year of history, heritage and archaeology. We're promoting a whole range of different activities to help tourism, a hugely important part of this part of the country's local economy, and we need tourism and we need tourists to visit, but to do so in a way that I think we can manage. So we're promoting the year of history, heritage and archaeology this year, but previously we've had a year of natural Scotland, and part of that was to bring together the different sectors, the tourism sector with particularly those that are working in the natural part, the natural environment, to see how we can best have projects together, but also to understand that. And the John Muir Way, for example, you mentioned the John Muir Trust, a very important legacy as part of that year, to have that link and to actually celebrate somebody who's contributed not just to the natural environment here in Scotland, but also internationally in the world. So very conscious of those areas, but tourism really is the lifeblood of part of rural Scotland, and we've got to make sure that we can encourage people to come here, but to do so responsibly.
With all respect, I get the idea of balance. It is critical. But when things like Stronglair Wind Farm was overturned and it looks like it's happening, people have not lived off this land for hundreds of thousands of years by pouring concrete into it. And that's what we're doing more and more of. I don't see wild spaces as something that we have to keep off, but it should be an active and integral part to intelligent tourism. Because indeed, going back to Rosanna's point, it cross-cuts our culture, our history, our heritage and our tourism. That's my concern. Please make sure that there are ways of every time a tree is brought down, for the sake of a road, whatever it might be, somebody's land and this woman whose house is going to be so surrounded by, is somehow rebalanced elsewhere. And it's that local and national active rebalancing that I would love to see more of, because I'm not yet convinced that that balance you talk about is being lived on the ground.
Well, that's what we've got to... That's what we've got to work at doing, and we don't always get it right, and we won't always get it right, which is why, you know, all of these things are surrounded by processes that are designed. They don't always work the way people would want them to, but designed to try to make sure we do get it right. But you, and I think Susie, I'm going to hand over to Keith to talk about the A9, you've encapsulated something that is genuinely very difficult for governments, is to balance the constant, you know, pressure we have for, you know, new infrastructure to make life easier for business, make life easier for people living their lives, with protecting the environment and protecting the wild spaces and everything that makes our country so great. I don't want to oversimplify this, but I was talking about being up at the Dam Visitor Centre earlier on, and if you probably all have visited it, but if you haven't, there's a big industrial development, and much of that visitor centre is talking not just about how they built the dam and did the tunnelling, but the work that was done to protect the salmon and to protect the environment around that. So in a very small scale, there is inaction, you know, that balance that has to be struck. So I think we'd all accept and probably always will have work to do to get these things more right, but there's always going to be that tension there, and I think everybody would recognise that. Susie, I'm going to hand over to Keith to talk about the A9 in particular, because absolutely we recognise where you're coming from, and you're the personification of some of these really difficult decisions that we think are difficult but are much more difficult for you. We've had similar issues around the bypass in Aberdeen. I remember in my own constituency when the M74 was being completed, some of these, not just about compulsory purchase of property, but the proximity of a major road to where people are living. Sure, well, I'm going to hand over to Keith because as I say, there are processes around this, some of which we have to, in terms of individual cases, we have to be slightly cautious about getting too far into. But nevertheless, I want Keith to try and answer your question and then see if we can open up a dialogue after this meeting to try and address as far as we can some of the concerns that you have.
The point that's been made already by Rosanna about balance and by Kirsty is very important. And in relation to the A9, which of course is a series of phases going up to 2025, we are trying to achieve that. For example, in relation to active travel, so at the same time as looking at the contracts for the online upgrading of the road, we're also looking to make sure we can have contracts which will look after the active travel side by side with that, because we want to try and improve that in terms of intelligent tourism. It is extremely difficult. You're right, it's a beautiful part of the country. My grandfather was born at Faskilly and moved to Brora, and I've been going up and down the A9 since the 1960s, and it has developed over that time, there's no question of that, but you travel, just same with the driver today, it's one of the best drives you can have in Scotland. And there is a real balancing act to try and make sure that we can upgrade that to allow the people that want to come here. We've seen, I think, 11% increase in tourism this year alone. The people that want to come here to be able to do that in safety and comfort as well, at the same time as looking after both the environment and the individuals. Now, in relation to the particular location, it's probably the toughest location we've got in the whole of the dualling. The dualling, I should say, as the First Minister said earlier on, is part of a programme which is seeking to make sure that we have at least dual carriageway, not necessarily motorway, between all of Scotland's cities. And that's for economic and other reasons as well. I should say that's accompanied also by substantial investment on the railway at the same time. It's not just about roads. But you come at probably the toughest part of the project. I've had lots of representations, obviously, from residents, probably including yourself, as has John Swinney as well. You've made a lot of representations to Transport Scotland. I've tried to look at those and respond to those. And we believe that that is, in relation to what you say, perhaps the least worst of the options, because if you go either side of where it's currently planned in the online solution, you've got major challenges there as well. Now, it is, as the First Minister said, it's just a function of being in government. You have difficult choices to make, and we won't necessarily always get them right. And we have to rely on the experts and interrogate the experts as to what they say, whether it's because of the presence of flooding, and there's more work to be done in relation to the section that we're talking about in relation to understanding fully the problems in relation to flooding. We also have additional exhibitions taking place in Mid-Athol Hall on Wednesday the 15th of February and Thursday the 16th of February, just so people can better understand the proposals that we have. We've looked at this a number of times. I would say, as the First Minister has said, there are ways in which we can try to deal with individual circumstances. I appreciate the point you've made that you're a tenant. Happy to have a discussion after we finish this session as to how we can perhaps take that into account. It's not an easy decision. That tends to be the nature of the decisions in government, but we've tried to do it with as much sensitivity to the situation of people like yourself as possible. Sorry?
The decision that was made on December the 5th for the final route of the road from the Taperidge to Ballinoo, that goes through a floodplain. Myself, I was flooded last year. As John Swinney is aware, because thankfully to John, I managed to get sandbags. I had 4 foot of water at my gates. If I flood again after they do this road, I have no way out. For an ambulance to attend to my property, a 3-minute time is added to that journey. I keep ill health, I have a heart condition. My husband's got cancer. If we needed an ambulance, that extra 3 minutes could cost one of our lives. Are you happy that it's going to put people's lives at risk?
Look, that, of course, nobody would be happy with a situation that puts anybody's life at risk. What we're trying to explain here are the difficult decisions that have to be made with projects like this. Now, I absolutely understand that we're sitting here talking about it in a sort of abstract sense. It's very personal to you, and we understand that. But when you're doing a project like this, we have to rely on expert evidence, and often the expert evidence and advice is looking at what is the least disruptive way of doing something as opposed to what is the ideal way of doing something. That doesn't make it easier for you. What we're saying is we absolutely hear what you're saying, and we want to try and work with people affected in the best possible way. Well, hopefully, what I was going to suggest is, given that I want to get some more questions in before we finish today, if Keith sits down with you afterwards, just to make sure that we are doing or making sure that it is being done as much as possible to try to deal with the individual circumstances you're in. Okay?
Okay, time is against us, so I think we've got time for one more round of questions. There's a couple of people who've had their hand up the whole time, so the lady here in red. Yeah.
I'm local and I was born here, okay? So over the last few years, 10, 20 years or so, I appreciate what you say about the ambulances, but we have one ambulance in this area, one. If it's out on call and we need another ambulance, we have to wait for it to come from Crieff, Blairgowrie, wherever. We used to have clinics here that used to be up at the old cottage hospital. The clinics, eventually, over the years, they've gone to Perth. There are still some here. They've gone to Perth. Now they've gone to Ninewells. We have a state-of-the-art hospital down there. It's half closed. One of the wards is closed within a few years. It's been utilised, but it's been underutilised. You know, our health service here, if we're ill and we fall ill, I'm in a position now of my parents' appointments. They're all in Ninewells. I have to take a day off to take them an hour and a half's journey. I'm not even counting the time that I've got to take them in. How are you going to get, you want people to come into the rural economy to live here. Having lived here all my life, I'm thinking, I don't want to live here when I retire. I don't like the health service here. It's fallen. And I'm not even going to start on out of hours opening. We've been talking about this for 18 months now. We've had meetings for 18 months. And we're not even off the starting block yet. We're still at the starting block waiting for something to happen. So you're my government, you're in control of my country. What are you going to do for me and for other people in this area?
Thank you. The gentleman right at the front here.
Thank you. My name is Omar Shamma. I'm a British Muslim, married to a Scot, retired in Scotland after 36 years away from the UK. I have a great admiration for you, First Minister. I think you're an excellent speaker, politician, determined. I don't agree with all your policies. One of the issues that I have a problem with, and I think it's great if it gets solved for the local economy here, there's a stately home in Kenmore called Taymouth Castle. Has anyone heard of that? Have you heard of that? This has been on and off development for ages. I recently invested in it in a fractional investment. I can't get hold of the developer. No one comes back to me. Nothing has been done. I came here all excited, perhaps made an emotional investment. You know, it's great to be, invest in a stately home, in a castle, developed into a 5-star hotel. I could see the opportunities for the golf and other sort of Glen Eagles. Can't get hold of anyone. Nothing has happened. Deadlines have passed. It's just gone into the ether. I've tried to get help. I've called up all sorts of agencies and so forth, and I just get thrown, oh, try this, try that, try the other. End up with a local solicitor, and he says, well, it's very difficult. You've got to prove that something, fraud or something is not correct. Otherwise, you just have to chase up the developer. And I'm stuck. And I'm sure others in the local economy and elsewhere have had this, are suffering from this issue.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman in green right at the back.
My name's Mark McGee, and for 3 years I've been wanting to build a swimming pool in Pitlochry. right? I've spoken to councillors, SNP, I've spoken to Labour, I've spoken to the Tories, and there is no encouragement from them. Yeah, I've spoken to scientists and company owners throughout the world on revolutionary technology for renewable energy to put on the plot of land, as well as energy created by means that we know work. So how come I can get companies from all around the world to speak to me and encourage me to try and do a project for the youth of today, as well as being financially viable when swimming pools aren't in the UK? They lose between £60,000 and £100,000, whereas I can get mine running without that loss. Yet every single councillor I've spoken to will not give me the time of day to do something like this, because Pitlochry is a tourist village. So if it's only for the tourists, what about the kids that are growing up? I've got a son that's 3 and is going to be going to school here, and this is my aim for it. Yet I can't get a councillor to stand beside me and even listen to the idea in full, because you're too busy. Yeah, the A9's important, but all you're doing is greasing palms to building companies.
I can assure you we're not.
Well, you subsidise that, and no doubt it's not cheap. These companies aren't doing that without making big money. Yeah, it keeps people in employment, but you're guaranteed at the end of the day, they will be making money off of doing that. So how can you help the individual person that's trying to do something good without looking at the grander scale of things like that?
Thank you.
Okay, Shona, if you can deal, so I didn't catch your name. Rita. Rita's questions, very legitimate questions about local access to healthcare. There's questions around ambulance cover, which you've partly talked about already, but I think the broader question was around access to outpatient clinic services, or more general services here in Pitlochry. And the hospital, which is a good question, actually. I remember opening Pitlochry Community Hospital. It's a great facility. Yeah. Right, well, I'm going to ask Shona to try and address some of that. Omar, I'm going to take advantage of John Swinney's local knowledge here and get him to address some of your issues around your investment in the castle. And Mark, I can't comment on the particular pros and cons of your swimming pool project, although it sounds like a great idea. I maybe ask John also to touch on that as your local MSP. I'm not sure if Ian Miller from the council is still with us. I think he maybe had to leave. But I think the most useful thing we can do for you today is try to hook you up with the right people to get them to listen to you, because we can't make a decision as government on a swimming pool in Pitlochry. But you're absolutely right that you should be able to get people to listen to you and give you advice as to how to take things forward. So John, maybe you could touch on that as well. But firstly, Shona, do you want to take on Rita's points about health services?
Yeah, we'll make sure we get Rita's details at the end so I can send her more detail than I'm going to be able to cover just now. But a couple of things to say about the, first of all, the ambulance service. They've got a new operating model, which is really about trying to get the ambulance to those who need it most quickly. The old system was designed in about the 1940s, so it wasn't really fit for purpose. So that new system has been operating for a few months, and it will help. I am very confident will help make sure in rural areas that the ambulances are better utilised in the right way. So I can write to you with a bit more detail about how that's going to impact, and also the new paramedics that will be coming on stream, some of which will be working in the community in new ways and going out to treat people in their own home, which again I think in rural areas is going to be a really important new resource. They also, with the new health and care partnerships, one of the things they're doing in this area is really looking at redesigning the community hospitals so that they become what's being called local community hubs, bringing together health and social care and some of the voluntary sector organisations to work together to make sure the needs of people are better met. Now, it is always difficult to get the balance right between what services that are more specialist and where they need to be, and services that you would expect to see within communities more generally. And the new plan that we have published is about, and the new national clinical strategy is really trying to get that balance right. So if you need a very specialist service, then yes, you may well have to travel to Nine Wells for that. But if it's a service that you would expect to get more locally, that should be provided locally. Plus trying to get clinicians out doing some of their outpatient clinics and in the community more often. And these new redesigned community hospitals, I think, could be a good hub for clinicians to come out and see some of the patients more locally. Yeah, so that is being worked on, and we'll get your contact details, and we're very happy to get the services to furnish you with more detail around these plans. It won't all happen overnight, but the direction of travel, I think, is one that will benefit areas like this so that we can get sustainable services in.
I think it would be good to, as you say, get Rita's details, because what I'm hearing here is a concern about underutilisation of Pitlochry. And, you know, as I say, it is a fantastic asset. So just what you've talked about there, which is the direction of travel in terms of hub services, and, you know, to get a bit more detail from the Health Board, is what that means for the future development of services here in Pitlochry. So if we can try and join up the national strategy there with the specifics here locally for you. Okay. Well, what would be helpful, I think, if we took one person's details who can be the point person for the whole group. And John, over to you to deal with Omar, and if you can touch on Mark's point too.
Yeah, well, the development of Taymouth Castle, this essentially started, if my memory serves me right, probably around about 2002 or 2003. And it got to a point where historic building consent for, you know, Taymouth Castle was empty at that stage, and when it got to historic building consent in about 2004, if my memory serves me correct. And since then, it has been a story of on-off development. You're absolutely right, Mr. Shamar. Now, and that's been about availability of money, it's been about developer commitment, and it has gone on making some progress and then stalled and not progressing. Now, obviously, yours is a very specific situation. You know, this is a market development. You know, essentially, it was conceived that it would be upgraded and then leased out to a hotel group, and a hotel group would operate it. And that's not come to fruition in the current market. Your situation is very specific because, obviously, you've made a financial commitment and an investment. So I'm very happy to speak to you afterwards and to find out, well, just get the details, and I'll happily pursue the developers to try to advance your interests as a constituent. I'm very happy to do so. On Mark McGee's point about a Pitlochry swimming pool, again, you know, obviously there's various assessments done and discussions by the local authority about the development of facilities in the locality. Obviously, there's been strategic decisions taken about the development of leisure facilities in different parts of Highland Perthshire, and there's been aspirations to enhance those facilities, the development of a significant new leisure facility as part of Bredalbin Academy in Aberfeldy, but there's been aspirations to develop other facilities in Dunkeld and Burnham and also in Pitlochry. So again, I'm very happy to talk to you afterwards, Mark, to just identify exactly where you've reached with the proposals and to make sure that your ideas are taken and given very serious consideration by the bodies that have got to do so. So I'll catch you afterwards.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. That's been a fantastic range of questions. Apologies to the small number of folk who I haven't managed to call, but remember, you've got the sheets on your chairs. If you do fill in the questions, you will get a written response. The alternative is to join us for a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and take up the issues directly with individual cabinet ministers. So I hope you will be able to join us in the front foyer. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, can I say a huge thank you on behalf of the First Minister and the Cabinet. Thank you very much.